Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pants on Fire Exposing Ruling Class Lies. In today's episode, we talk to Andres, who is the president and CEO of a nonprofit organization called Inclusion Americas. He's also a co chair of the Americas subcommittee of CPUSA's Peace and Solidarity Commission. We also talked to Alvaro, who is the chair of the International Department of CPUSA, as well as the Texas District Chair. We discussed the U.S.-Mexico border and how U.S. imperialism is creating a crisis. We hope you enjoy. So in the Peace and Solidarity Commission, you're on the Committee for the Americas. What types of work are you guys working on in that particular committee?
We're seeking greater understanding and solidarity with the popular movements of Latin America and the Caribbean. We do so by encouraging members of the party and other colleagues and comrades to prepare to write articles that for general public as well as for members of the party, illuminating issues, doing in-depth analysis of issues related to the politics of the countries of Latin America and the relationship between the U.S. and the other countries of the Americas, of the 35 countries of the Americas. Work with existing solidarity groups, such as those working with Cuba, with Venezuela, and with other Latin American countries, to promote and genuine understanding and peace and solidarity among the people of the Americas.
Mm-hmm. So there's lots going on in the Americas, obviously. And so this conversation today, we're talking about Mexico and the U.S.-Mexico border specifically. And a few weeks ago, Greg Abbott declared that there was an invasion at the border. And so I guess, could you provide a little bit of context and background on
Sure.
Yeah, I know it's not a new idea. This has been going on for a long time.
Right. And in fact, it wasn't really, it was a tweet and a press release that came out of Texas Governor Greg Abbott's office that stated that in his view, there was an invasion occurring along the border as of right before Thanksgiving. And but what it really was an amplification of the existing policy of Operation Lone Star that's been put in place by the Abbott administration, that has state police officials, including the Department of Public Safety, which is essentially their highway patrol, and the Texas Rangers and the National Guard, conduct vigilance of the border between Texas and the United States. Let's keep in mind that of the land border, 2/3 of the land border between the U.S. and Mexico is the state of Texas. So that they play an outsized role in the borderlands relationships between Mexico and the United States. And just earlier this year, the same Governor Abbott began a campaign of pretty much halting border land commerce, because the trucks coming across the border to either leave off materials or pick up materials, the semi-trailers were being stopped one by one to be inspected, because the Abbott's administration claimed that these trucks were carrying immigrants. And in fact, actually, the incidents that we heard of where immigrants died in the back of these container and these semi trucks, it wasn't because they were brought across the border. They were picked up on the U.S. side of the border, and these trucks abandoned them. So there was never any evidence that immigrants were being crossed from these cargo trucks. But nevertheless, as a political stunt, Abbott pursued it to such an extent that the truck operators made a deal, and they created an entry point just west of El Paso through the state of New Mexico. And this actually, in the end, harmed Texas's ability to earn money from the ground trade, and it was really another kind of like to cut off my nose to spite my face move on the part of the Abbott administration, claiming that undocumented immigrants were being brought over by these cargo trucks, and that wasn't in any way true. So this is also in the context of him having declared Operation Lone Star, in which Texas is trying to implement U.S. immigration policy, which of course is illegal because no single state can implement U.S. immigration policy, does not have the authority to do so. But in that context, then right after his big election win against Beto O'Rourke on November 8th, and around the week of coming close to Thanksgiving, we have him making this declaration. Actually, I believe it was the week before Thanksgiving. It was the 16th of November that he made this declaration that there was an invasion. And we've seen another Republican governor who is now leaving office because of term limits, Doug Ducey of Arizona, who most recently has been trying to put container boxes that go with the cargo trucks and the trains and the boats on the border as a pseudo border wall. And in fact, there's demonstrations by pro-immigrant groups that are preventing any further construction of this container border wall while Ducey remains in office. Ducey was trying to put this in place right before he leaves office as governor at the beginning of January. So you have not only the Abbotts of the world, you have the Duceys of the world doing similar kinds of actions unilaterally as a state, supposedly on the assertion that there's a border invasion occurring between Mexico and the United States.
Yeah, I mean, this was the basis of Trump's campaign and his announcement to run for president, was that the people crossing the border were, what do you say, bad hombres,
Right. They were rapists, they were murderers, gang members, thieves. Yes, that was the premise of Trump's original campaign when he came down that elevator. I believe it was in 2015 when he came down the elevator, and because the election itself was in 2016. It's part of the scapegoating and the creation of a mythology about what in fact is happening when immigrants come across the border. A large number of the immigrants coming across the border today are people who are seeking either asylum or refugee status, coming from countries where there are tremendous conflicts and pressures and social issues and humanitarian crises, including Haiti, for example. And you could even say Venezuela to a large extent, and partly because there are conflicts there, and not related to the U.S. attempt to try to manipulate and starve out the Venezuelan government. But Haiti is a clear choice of where there's a humanitarian crisis. But people are coming from other countries as well. People are coming in from Cuba, a large degree because of the tightening of the sanctions, the economic sanctions on the blockade, in part because of the collapse of the tourist economy, given COVID, in part because there was a tightening of the U.S. economic blockade during the Trump administration, with measures that were not eliminated by the Biden administration. We're seeing possibly 100,000 Cubans coming across into the United States during calendar year 2022, unprecedented in the post-revolutionary history of Cuba. So there are many things happening in the world. Some of them are the blowback of U.S. interventions in other countries, such as the U.S. interventions or the sanctions on Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, but also many of these other countries are facing extreme economic hardship. but it does not constitute in any way, shape, or form an invasion. What it does constitute is a series of challenges created by in part U.S. policy, in part economic necessity, and there had been these policies. For example, the Title 42 that claimed that for health reasons due to the pandemic, the U.S. could prevent people from crossing the border. And that's in part what inspired the warehousing of immigrants along the U.S.-Mexican border. Because if you apply for a refugee or asylee status and you claim that status at the border, you're supposed to be allowed to stay in the U.S. while they are processing your claim. But what the U.S. government was doing in the Trump administration was requiring the people to wait for their hearing on the Mexican side of the U.S.-Mexican border, which in fact was a violation of U.S. immigration policy and was a violation of Mexican sovereignty.
Now, Title 42, that's a Trump era policy, right? That was enacted, as a way to.
Title 42 existed before Trump, but it wasn't really used in any massive way. It was only in Trump when it became an excuse to keep people who were crossing the border and applying for refugee or asylum status from staying in the U.S. while they were awaiting the decision on their status.
Yeah, and so
Title 42 is actually an existing provision of immigration law that was to be used in extraordinary circumstances, but became used in a daily exercise by the border patrol under the Trump administration.
What's going on with? We talked about this a little bit before we started recording. That I think that people in the U.S., especially like reactionaries and conservatives, they see this impending wave of migrants coming across the border, and they're fearful about that. They're fearful that it's going to exhaust resources for U.S. citizens. It's going to,
right.
You just and I think that there's this idea that they're coming from Mexico, and that's not necessarily the case, right? I mean, a lot of them.
Well, right. Well, in fact, most of the immigrants that are coming across the border are not from Mexico. They're coming across the Mexican border, but they're traveling through Mexico to get to the United States, and that's that. Of course, the Guatemalans, the Salvadorans, the Hondurans, even the Nicaraguans and the Cubans, the Venezuelans, they're coming through, and the Haitians, as well as people from other countries, including African countries.
Mm-hmm.
They're coming into the U.S. via Mexico. Mexican migration it continues. For the most part, there are other strategies that Mexican immigrants have. Partly, many of them already have family in the United States. Some of them are able to actually travel with tourist visas and then overstay their visas. There are some Mexican immigrants that are being caught up in border crossers that we're seeing now, but it's not primarily Mexican immigrants. It's actually interesting as well that from about 2008, beginning with the economic crisis of the 2007-8 period, Mexican migration was flat. In fact, there was no increase in net Mexican migration roughly from 2009 until 2019. For some reason, right before the pandemic ended, and there might have been some economic changes occurring in Mexico, you began to get Mexican immigration again, but it's not in very large numbers. And of course, the Mexican people crossers who get across, they're not applying for refugee or asylee status. So percentage-wise, relatively few of the migrants coming over the border themselves are from Mexico.
So a lot of the I guess a lot of the myths that people have that are going around about this is that these are illegal aliens, they call
Right.
them. They
Right.
are coming to exhaust all of our social safety net resources. They come over, they cross the border so that they can get on our what little limited welfare system that we do have in the
Right.
US.
Mhm.
And of course then there's also the idea that they're taking American jobs, they're taking
Right.
jobs in the US. And so it's interesting that the distinction is that what we're seeing today at the border is mostly asylum seekers.
Right. Or refugee seekers.
So what's
People
the
seeking refugee status. Well, it's interesting, and it came to my mind. Of course, a lot of the Mexican and some of the Central American, they're coming across with temporary agricultural visas, and they can get across the border because they have these visas. The H-2A program, we're actually having a revival of the Bracero program from the 50s and 60s. It's done under the H-2A, where these farm corporations, industrial farms, agribusiness, they recruit foreign workers under the auspices of this visa system to basically hire indentured servants that are farm workers in the U.S. People paid under the minimum wage, people with no health benefits whatsoever. Those who stay around, they have to go to Medi-Cal, but they're not or Medicaid, but they're not eligible because they're temporary workers. The real myth is that immigrants are coming here to either freeload or commit crimes. The vast majority of the Central American and Mexican immigrants that come as immigrants come as workers to do jobs that no U.S. citizen is doing. We saw during the pandemic that a large number of farm workers were suffering from COVID infections and unbearable working conditions with less than minimum wage and no health benefits. And this again we're seeing in the current situation. In the case of Mexicans, many of the farm workers coming over are actually indigenous people, Zapotec, Mixtec speaking people, who are the ones who are the most desperate in terms of trying to earn income. So a good part of U.S. immigration by Mexicans and Central Americans to the United States is driven by people who are coming to work and doing essential work, such as crop picking in agriculture or food processing. It's interesting that the states that have the largest numbers of these H-2A workers who are the agricultural workers, and there's a version of it for construction workers, are in the states of California and Florida. Come to think of it. Now, none of these people are crossing the border as refugees. The refugee problem is a whole other element to this, because in fact it's a very diverse set of immigrants coming across the border for a variety of reasons. And that's again another myth, that people are just coming across because they want to live off of social services. And as you described, they cannot, because it's illegal for these people to have access to social services or health care, publicly supported health care. It is true in California in this last year that the Medi-Cal program was expanded by the state to include all workers, regardless of immigration status. So undocumented people in California can have access to needs-based, income-based Medicaid, which in California is called Medi-Cal.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a very narrow, and that's not what we would call welfare, in the sense that these are people who are working but they don't earn enough income, nor do they have access for benefits. So that, of course, the Medicaid program is a solution for them to have health care insurance, as any other worker should have.
I want to discuss this article I just saw this morning from the New York Times that says, the mass migrant crossing floods Texas border facilities, and it's talking about thousands of people that have crossed into West Texas, so at the El Paso
Right.
border, and it does seem like they are coming from Nicaragua mostly.
Yeah. There's some Venezuelans there too. What's interesting about that is I'm not sure how. As I understood it, a number of these immigrants, and apparently there were more Venezuelans going east of El Paso, but the ones who had gathered here, apparently they had been caught under the earlier, some of them under the earlier Title 42, before Biden administration withdrew 42 protections or utilized Title 42 for all immigrants and then just focused on Venezuelans. Apparently, some of these Nicaraguans had been also in Mexico waiting for the processing of their immigration applications, and that they're now going across after having been on the Mexican side for a while. And others were more recently arrivals from Nicaragua, because there is now a growing number of migrants coming from Nicaragua, given the economic and political turmoil there since for the last 3 or 4 years. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It does seem,
but again, these Nicaraguans are also claiming refugee status.
and so you talked about refugee status and asylum status.
Right.
What is the distinction between those two different types of
well,
status?
Asylum is kind of, I think, an immediate, there's an immediate need because of an immediate threat. And refugee is a little bit more longer term, saying that people can't make a life because they're unable to make a regular life given the circumstances of the government of their country and that sort of thing. They're very similar, but asylum has a much more immediate threat of danger to life and livelihood.
Yeah. So I mean, they are the media is covering this as though it is a
immigration.
Yeah. I mean, they've got like drone footage of these people.
Right.
Coming across.
It's dramatic. Okay, the reason it's dramatic is because it looks like this large queue of people is because these folks had been waiting on the Mexican side, and the word got through that the date of this of the court restriction was being had been reached, so that there no longer was the restriction on 42, and that's why they were crossing the border. So folks had been waiting in large part, and of course that then reinforces this image that that quote unquote there's an invasion, that hundreds of thousands of people want to cross. Many of this was just bottled up, people waiting on the Mexican side, and now that the restriction has been lifted, they're crossing the border. And of course they've been crossing Mexico for the land border, and I guess they're interviewing these folks.
Yeah.
Now it could also be that some of the immigrants that were waiting in other parts of Mexico with a release of Title 42 felt that now was an appropriate time to go. I wouldn't know exactly why El Paso became the place for this particular crossing. Typically, it's been the other Texas border crossings, because you have to imagine that El Paso and Juarez are like sister cities. That the downtown of Juarez is right on the border, and you can walk right across into El Paso. There's thousands of border crossings every day. 20% of the students at the University of Texas, El Paso live on the Juarez side, are Mexican nationals that go to college on the Texas side in El Paso. So this type of crossing in El Paso is quite unusual. You don't see people crossing over the river. You see people just walking over the land bridge. El Paso's not new to people crossing the border, but it is new to having people crossing in this manner, who obviously are not the regular commuters that go across the border.
Yeah. So I mean, it just seems like, I guess, to think about a family that is fleeing some harmful, dangerous conditions in one of these Central or South American countries.
Right.
They obviously don't have the resources to just get on a plane and fly here.
Right.
So
right. Although they do expend quite a bit of resources paying some of these smugglers, these coyotes, take quite a considerable sum of money. Cubans will spend $12,000 or more to cross the border, because the problem with many of the people trying to cross the border, they can't get on an airplane. One, there's limited flight service out of Cuba, and two, there's you have to have a passport and visa requirement, a visa stamps to come in from selected countries on an airplane. So you can't get on an airplane so readily, although many of these migrants are actually spending large sums of money to cross the border.
Mm-hmm. And that's something a lot of these articles don't really talk about, is that that little business, the business side of it from the coyotes, and just how dangerous this is, and the amount of deaths. I saw something talking about the amount of deaths from border crossings, and how the data is like we don't even know how accurate that data is because it's underreported. But people are drowning trying to cross the border. Obviously, we had the big story with the people in the truck that was also in Texas. But what does it look like for someone fleeing? Let's just say they're fleeing Nicaragua. How do they get to the U.S.? How do they get to the border, and how do they get to El Paso?
Actually, you made me want to look back at the actual definition in the U.S. of an asylee and refugee. Technically, a refugee a refugee can apply for refugee status from a third country. But they're seeking refugee status, and an asylee faces the same conditions as a refugee, but for some reason makes it into the United States and files a claim in the United States. And the people who are crossing the border, it's interesting. The people who are crossing the border by foot can actually fit in under either one of those categories, because if they've already stepped foot in the United States, they can seek asylum, which is in a sense a special kind of refugee status. But you can apply for refugee status outside of the United States. You don't have to cross the border. So the border it's kind of like it's a gray zone in a certain point between asylum and refugee status. But But all asylees are refugees, but not all refugees are asylees. That's how it works. Well, those are the legal definitions. Now, in terms of what an international definition of an asylee is, that's another story. But this was what the legal U.S. definition is.
And I do see like the Biden administration, is continuing some of these Trump era policies, and in some cases, I saw an article on NBC News,
right,
the Biden administration working to slash the number of migrants who would qualify for asylum. So
right.
If that number decreases,
because every country is assigned a certain number of, there's an overall number, and then there's a per country number, and the Department of Homeland Security can determine based on circumstances what those numbers should be. So
Yes.
they're getting criticized for supposedly letting too many people in the border, and then they're also getting criticized for reducing the number of refugees and asylees, particularly from given countries. And that's they're trying to conduct a balancing act, and it's not exactly working. What would work would be what would work better would be some kind of transparency about the number of refugees and explaining why a certain number is justified given the circumstances of countries across the Americas and throughout the world. It's also interesting that the Biden administration is taking some small steps. For example, they returned to the Obama era policy of only deporting people who have committed serious crimes and not for solely those who violated immigration law. So they don't want to expend, as Obama's administration did, they don't want to expend all the policing resources of ICE to try to deport people who are here illegally. They're only focusing on those who commit capital crimes, such as robbery, burglary, robbery, murder, physical assault. Those type of quote criminals are the ones that are being sought by ICE now. And of course, the Biden administration is getting criticism saying that anybody who violates immigration law should also be subject to deportation, even though they're minding their own business and working and having a fruitful and safe life. So there are those things going on right now too. We have to remember that during the Trump administration, we had a group of ideologues and racists such as Stephen Miller, and these people were aggressively going after all types of immigrants. They're also the Border Patrol officers union is an incredibly pro-MAGA, proto-fascist organization. If you look at their Twitter feed, they call themselves the Border Patrol Union. That's not their formal name. They were kicked out of the AFL-CIO in the summer. And since then, they become even more rapidly Trumpian Republican and criticizing everything that Mayorkas does, everything that the Biden administration does. It's a daily feed on Twitter. It could be QAnon, and it's representing the board. This is the guild that represents the Border Patrol workers, and this is a big problem, because if the enforcement people themselves have an ideological view of what's going on the border, then that means they're not really serving the greater U.S. interest. They're serving some other interest, the interest of a proto-fascist movement in the U.S.
Yeah,
I encourage you to look at you can get angry at half the time, but get on the Twitter feed of the Border Patrol Union, and they're obviously anti-Democrat in any shape or form. They're anti-Joe Biden. They criticize any public official that defends immigrants. The language is combative, and it's demeaning, and it's racist, and it's anti-immigrant.
Of course.
Yeah.
I think that's the
when in U.S. history have we had the organized arm of the Border Patrol coming out publicly and supporting right-wing candidates? This is something of the last 4 or 5 years. Well, remember Trump's first presidential campaign, he said that he represented the ICE. What he meant to say is he represented Border Patrol workers.
Yeah, that was kind of a self-report on
right.
him, a little slip of the tongue there. Yeah,
well,
I mean,
he thought it was a badge of honor.
What do you think this is? Is it just flat out racism? Is it xenophobia that's fueling this fear mongering that we see in the media, especially the more right wing media?
Yes, it's part of the agenda. It's part of this overall agenda to divide the white working class, to divide the working class into these categories that are imposed. I mean, the racialization of Latin Americans, of Mexicans, Central Americans, Caribbeans, that's a social construct. Because I mean, these folks are these folks come from nations. They're nationalities. They have national origin. There's no such thing as a Salvadoran race or a Mexican race or a Honduran race. They're all nationalities. None of them are races. But in the concept of racism in the U.S., in the structure of racism, people who are Latin American are considered to be of a race, of a brown race, which doesn't exist. It's in the fantasy of the racists, of the proto-fascists. And for example, in the history of the U.S., this was particularly the racialization of Latin American and Caribbean people was particularly strong against Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, because these are the two people that have the longest history with the United States. And in fact, for a long period of time, people, racist folks in Southern California and in the borderlands would call Central Americans Mexicans, because in their view, all these folks looked the same. There was this famous incident with there were these Salvadoran workers that had a union in Los Angeles in the early 1990s, and these hecklers would drive by on the street telling them to go back to Mexico when they were Salvadorans. So there's this confusion in the U.S. racial hierarchy and ideology about the role that Latino people play, and a lot of people assume that folks are Mexicans when they're not. But there's also an anti-immigrant element to this. The other, the foreigner. Hello, Alvaro. We're talking about right now the elements of racism and xenophobia that are involved in these movements, anti-immigrant movements, and these border closer people. To what extent is it racism? To what extent is it xenophobia? Well, I think the two play off of each other. And there is an anti-immigrant element because there's this sense that people are coming from another country, abroad, outside of the U.S., and because there's an existing racial hierarchy in the U.S. where brown people are considered a race instead of nationalities, and that we see in the MAGA right this tendency to try to divide the working class by separating out immigrants and Latinos as being people who are supposedly not part of the same working class. But of course, this serves the interests of the powers that be, particularly the right-wing, self-appointed Christian nationalists, because it becomes an ideological focus that brings people away from class unity and towards further segregation and racial treatment.
They're looking for scapegoats.
Right.
And
exactly.
This is an easy scapegoat they certainly don't want U.S. workers to have class consciousness and to be aware of what's really going on.
Right.
Andres kind of went through and gave an overview of the background of the crisis and the what Abbott is calling an invasion at the border, and so I've been asking questions about who are the people that are crossing the border, and what is it that's fueling this? The way the media describes it is like this unprecedented surge of migrant crossings, and we've been trying to connect the dots a little bit to U.S. policy and U.S. imperialism.
Right. I'm sure that Andres offered a very good explanation of the whole context in which this issue is being discussed. I think it's good, even if I have cover some of the same ground, I think it's good to discuss the root cause of the migration issue. The root cause is that, well, there's been migration between our countries in the Americas for forever. So this is a regular pattern. I know I'm an immigrant from Mexico myself, and my relatives live on both sides of the border, have lived on both sides of the border for decades and decades. And so it was very natural, obviously Mexicans have been part of Texas and Southwest since back in the 1500s. And so this is a natural home for many of us. And but the more recent migration problems that we've seen from Central America is driven primarily by U.S. imperialist policies in the Americas, where a lot of the countries in Central America and other areas, in southern Mexico and other areas, are driven to immigrate. Many of the people are driven to immigrate because of deliberate policy that were designed to drive campesinos, rural workers from these countries into the United States to work under precarious conditions of insecurity, of legal insecurity, in order to drive up profits in the United States. For the purposes of this, there was an agreement, the NAFTA agreement was one of them, and then later it was modified, but its purpose is mainly super exploitation and increased profits from immigrant labor. And so that's a driver from the U.S. side, from their side in Latin America and southern Mexico and other areas, in other areas of the world, because immigrants are coming in from all over the world. It's because they're driven out because of lack of job opportunities. There is insecurity in their own countries because of the gang wars and the drug wars, a lot of which were prompted by the U.S. policy. And they're driven by the treaties that have made it their economic livelihood in those countries unsustainable, by forcing them to compete with U.S. supported agribusinesses, which are major scale agribusinesses that are supported by taxpayer money, and they're trying to compete with subsistence farmers in the Americas. So that's unfair. The main driver, as far as the furor in the media, is the main driver, as Andres mentioned, is that immigrants are being used as a football to win elections in the United States. Primarily, it's the Republicans that are doing that, but the Democrats are also playing identity politics. And neither one of their administrations is really interested in solving this problem. There's the Biden administration, for instance, in the first few days after the new administration was in effect, offered a comprehensive immigration policy, none of which has actually been implemented. And so the reason being is that they're fighting over this sector of the community with the upcoming elections. Anyway, so the driver for this is super profits. And the reason it continues to be in the media is because of they're using this crisis of migrants to create, to get votes. And they're putting people's lives at risk. Many people, when I migrated to this country at the age of 3, we lived right on the border on the Rio Bravo. So I could see bodies floating down the river. They were trying to cross this barrier. And so that is the consequence of this policy, of which is an inhuman policy. There's no
and
need.
Of course, now we're seeing bodies in the desert in Arizona and Sonora, hundreds of bodies that never get reported, as if these people never existed. Yeah.
That's correct. I mean, this instead of seeing this as a humanitarian crisis, it's seen more as promoted as an invasion. By people that do not respect U.S. laws, and that's contrary to the facts. They come out of pure necessity. They leave their lives behind in their countries. Their culture is left behind to go into a new country. And then now they have to go through all this obstacle course and get into the United States and driven into more remote areas and risking their lives. And many have died, as Andres mentioned, in the process. So this is a human crisis, human rights issue also.
We talked about just the overall myth that like these people are coming to take jobs from the U.S. Like they're taking our jobs, and Andres kind of touched on that's not.
I think the important thing to state here, Kyle, with respect to this myth, is that immigrants or migrants that are coming to this country have no control over the jobs. Those are controlled by U.S. employers, and they have no problem finding jobs in this country. And because employers like to hire them in the service industry, in the construction industry, because they're hard workers and they work for very little. So that is the reason that they're hired by U.S. employers. If the U.S. wanted to implement legal policies, they should also state that it's illegal for these employers to hire undocumented workers, yet they do it all the time. And none of them has been arrested for this. They're arresting women and children and putting them in cages. Yet these employers are making super profits from migrants are not getting punished. So this is a double standard and inhumane standard.
And I think that's we talked about why neither side, the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, in a lot of ways, they are the same side in this particular issue. They're on the side of capital, and there's money to be made and there's less money to be made in any actual real solutions.
Exactly. The president of Mexico has initiated a jobs program in southern Mexico, planting trees that help the environment and also help families in that area to survive. And so he has offered this to the Biden administration every time the issue of the immigrant caravans or the migrant caravans get through. And the Biden administration has yet to implement any of these programs, because this would keep a lot of people employed in their own countries where they want to be. And but those programs have not been put into place. So that shows you there's not a good faith effort going on here.
No, I mean, I think that's the point that I wish that more people would get, that is that neither party in the U.S. that acts like it cares about this, like at the end of the day, they want more workers to exploit. They want more easily exploitable workers. So why would they do anything?
That's right. And they want them to work under precarious conditions. They don't want them to work under legal conditions, because if they wanted them to work under legal conditions, there's huge amount of labor demand in this country. The United States policy could be easily changed so that the United States government could issue immigration visas in those countries, whether it's in El Salvador or Guatemala or Honduras or in Mexico. They could issue those visas so that the people can come to this country with legal visas. They could do that if they were really serious about this issue, but they're not.
So in terms of our struggle, in the Communist Party, in the broader anti-imperialist movement, what are some of the things that we should be doing? What type of work and struggle should we be doing to just raise awareness, raise consciousness of this issue?
I think we should respond to the concerns about what's happening with respect to migration. What is the root causes of it, and what are the solutions? The solutions is to create jobs in the Americas for everybody in this country as well. And so we need a jobs program. That is the root solution. We need to stop the policies of U.S. imperialist policies of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank that plunder these countries and leave them with very limited resources, and that are used to further investment interest, capital interest in those countries. So we need to change those policies and to treat refugees with, in accordance to international norms, and to treat immigrants in a humane manner. So that's what has to happen. It's our responsibility to identify the root causes of this problem and to identify how is this issue is being used politically by the Republicans primarily, and also by Democrats. So what we want is a comprehensive immigration reform with a right, an expeditious right to citizenship for immigrants to this country. They want to stay in this country, and find a legal route for immigrants to get here without risking their lives and the lives of their family members. So we need a humane immigration policy, comprehensive immigration policies. We want to ensure that that children that were brought here by their parents are given an opportunity to stay in this country, since they are established a country and establish a life in this country. So this is the DACA program. We're in favor of giving them permanent residency and a quick path for citizenship.
So we have gone all over the place. We were looking at pictures from this New York Times article, and it was talking about. So we've talked about Nicaragua, we've talked about Venezuela. Specifically with, it seems like El Paso is in the news right now. That's the main focus. But we talked about all the other border crossings, Arizona, California, and then down like in Brownsville and Rio Grande Valley. Mm-hmm. And so I think we covered a lot of ground. But is there anything that you wanted to discuss specifically with regard to the U.S.-Mexico border?
No, just want to emphasize that we need to address the root cause of this migration issue. Also, in addition to that, I forgot to mention that in addition to those problems of U.S. imperialist policy in the region, we also have a drought. As I said, we have a dry problem. We have a lack of water now in the southern hemisphere, and that's creating a lot of problems for people who make a living, farmers, particularly campesinos, and so that's also driving them off the land. But there's a deliberate policy, and there has been a deliberate policy which is not discussed at all in the New York Times or anywhere else, about how there's a deliberate policy to drive campesinos off their land, the ejido land. A lot of the land in Mexico after the revolution became communal land. Mm-hmm. So the farmers had communal rights, but those rights have been undermined by the local neoliberal policies of the local governments, and also undermined by U.S. policies and agreements. The idea is to withdraw water from the farmers, and also withdraw price supports, and withdraw aid to the farmers, so they would be driven off the land. And now this communal land that was not able to sell, people that had communal land that could not sell their property are now allowed to sell their property. So they're selling their property at very low rates so they can leave and immigrate to the United States. So this is not mentioned, but it should be mentioned. That is still, that was a cost of the neoliberal implementation policy in the Americas. I think there's no mention of that at all. I would suggest, Kyle, that I'm going to send you a copy of the CPUSA's pamphlet on immigration. It's called Myths and Fake News or something like that. And it answers a lot of these questions in great detail by people that are knowledgeable on the issue. And so I think that that'll be good to have that on hand. I will send that to you, Kyle.
Okay, that'd be great. I think I have a print copy of it, and I think that we printed them. The Austin Club actually printed them ourselves, so I think we have access to the PDF file. And so, what I could do is when we publish this episode, I can put a link to that in the episode notes, so that listeners can read it.
A part of democracy is to have an informed electorate, and the electorate in this country is not informed, has been misinformed with fake news about migrants migrating to this country. And that's the reason that a lot of people are reacting knee-jerk fashion, and because they've been misinformed about this issue. And I think we need to state what the facts are, and then create a humane policy to deal with this humanitarian issue.
I think the key word is humane, and I think that what we're seeing with this sort of fascist rise all around the world, not just in the U.S., but just everywhere, is a lack of empathy and a lack of compassion, and not seeing these people as human beings.
That's correct. And this migration issues in the United States is very similar to what's happening in migration between Africa and Europe. And so this migration is worldwide. It's not just in our hemisphere. And but it's driven by the same factors: lack of opportunities, inequality between the developed capitalist countries and the developing countries. So this is what drives the migration. Basically, inequality and lack of opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing that for the U.S. to we invade these countries and we extract their resources and their wealth, and then we blame the people for leaving and coming here. But it's like we took everything.
Well, one of the myths that's been spread is that immigrants come into this country to supplant the European culture that's already here. This is a falsehood. Like I said, the migration has been going on for centuries, and Mexican people, for instance, or Latin people have been in this country for very long time. Mm-hmm. And also many of the migrants that come to this country are looking for job opportunities. They really don't come to stay. Most of them do not come to stay. If they were allowed to go back home, go back and forth, or go back home, they would do so. They cannot go back home now because the borders is closed, and they will find it very difficult to get back into the country to continue their job employment or other opportunities. So consequently, they have to stay here, establish their own families here, but it's not of their primary choice. Their primary choice is to come, earn some money, go back home with their loved ones they left behind, their parents, their grandparents, their own communities. Nobody comes here pretty much out of free choice. They come out here out of necessity. Mm-hmm. That's the way we have to understand the problem.
Yeah. I mean, I've got a friend who her husband is from El Salvador, and so all of her in-laws, some of them are still in El Salvador, some of them are in California, and they can't go visit their family because they don't have green cards. They won't be let back in.
That's correct. And sometimes what's happening is that parents are being deported, or sometimes children are being deported back to those not back to, but to those countries. They were not even born there. They haven't been. They were brought as children. Their countries are now not their home anymore. So this is very inhumane policy.
Yeah. And it goes to like just the definition of whiteness and how that has changed and evolved over time. I mean, the immigration of Irish people into this country, they were not seen as white at first, and then Italians were not seen as white. And then a few generations later, they have a new class of people that they look down on, and so then Italian people become white. And I think
that's right. I mean, right at one point, the official language of the United States was going to be German, because the majority of people in this country were German, and they left Germany. They were migrants from Germany, and so this is a country of immigrants, and it's been said again and again. Some people agree in general with that concept. But they say, well, yes, but all immigration should be legal. Well, there's nothing. We're saying, why don't we go ahead and make it legal for people to migrate to this country? We obviously have a labor shortage. There's huge demands for labor in this country. Why don't we give migrants, the same rights to same labor rights as U.S. workers? Why don't we allow them to join unions and then negotiate higher prices? If people are concerned about cheap labor, why don't we give them labor rights so they can negotiate higher wages and better working conditions? That is the humane solution. That is a solution that cares for people, not one in which we want to kick people out and treat them inhumanely.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that just about covers it.
Okay. Well, thank you, Kyle.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to Pants on Fire, Exposing Ruling Class Lies, the podcast produced by the International Department of CPUSA. Visit our website, cpusa.org, to learn more about the party. Follow us on Twitter at CPUSA Department, and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast app.